Our top focus on this special broadcast of the WION-VOA co-production remains the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Let's get you updated with the latest on-ground developments. US President Joe Biden announced $800 million in new security assistance to help Ukraine combat the Russian aggression and defend itself against the Russian invasion. And this all is in addition to the $200 million that has already been allocated last week. This followed an address by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to the US Congress, where he appealed for essentially more military assistance, more military intervention for Ukraine to help it combat Russian aggression. For more details, the White House Bureau Chief, Patsy Widakuswara, has this next report. Take a look.
Fighting between Russian and Ukrainian forces is intensifying in Kyiv, Mariupol, and other Ukrainian cities.
Putin is inflicting appalling devastation and horror on Ukraine, bombing apartment buildings, maternity wards, hospitals.
U.S. President Joe Biden approved $800 million in new security aid for Ukraine, in addition to the $200 million he allocated Saturday. These are part of a $13.6 billion aid package that the U.S. Congress passed last week. The $800 million will be for direct transfers of equipment, including anti-aircraft systems, anti-armor missiles, armed drones, small arms, ammunition, and body armor.
What's really stopping the Russians and inflicting considerable costs on the Russian military are these anti-aircraft weapons and systems. So I think there's a sort of tactical, practical reason why the focus has fallen on these weapon systems.
Earlier Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy virtually addressed the U.S. Congress and pleaded to Biden.
I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace.
Despite Zelenskyy's request, the U.S. will neither facilitate transfer of fighter jets nor support a no-fly zone.
The primary threat to Ukrainians is conventional artillery, conventional missiles, and conventional ground forces. A no-fly zone would affect none of that. So it runs a serious risk of escalation in exchange for very little effect on the actual course of events on the ground militarily in Ukraine. Transferring Polish fighter jets to the Ukrainians is the same kind of story.
Also Wednesday, NATO defense chiefs, including U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, met in Brussels. Fearing Moscow may broaden its attack to target NATO territory, the alliance is drawing up plans for new ways to deter Russia, said Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg.
To remove any room for miscalculation or misunderstanding in Moscow about our readiness to protect and defend all allies.
$4 billion from the $13.6 billion approved by Congress will provide humanitarian support for the more than 3 million Ukrainians displaced by the war. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News at the White House.
For more insights about what's actually happening on ground, as well as the U.S. reaction to all of this, joining us now with additional insights is Voice of America's correspondent Jessica Stone. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us. My first question to you, what is the current sentiment in Washington about how to help Ukraine combat the crisis?
Well, there's a conflicted sense. There's an overwhelming sense in Washington, as is among the American public, according to the latest Pew poll, that Americans want to help Ukraine. More than 80% of them responded to a poll saying they want to do something, but they don't want to do something militarily. They want to do something economically to pressure Russia. That's been very clear. And we have just gotten a little more impetus because this week, of course, we saw the first U.S. citizen death in Ukraine, a man from Minnesota by the name of James Hill. And just putting a name on that, I think, will also have an impact on the American public, a face really on the costs of this war inside the United States. But the costs are also incredibly fraught for Washington, because remember, Vladimir Putin has at his disposal chemical weapons, biological weapons, and certainly nuclear weapons. And the U.S. and the rest of the NATO alliance is very concerned that they could be drawn into a broader war, as you heard from Patsy's report there, they do not want Europe to become a target, much less the United States or other parts of the world, of Russia's escalation. And they don't want to give Russia any pretense of the ability to escalate this war. That said, you saw the congressional response to President Volodymyr Zelensky's remarks. They gave him several standing ovations. And just yesterday, on Thursday here in the U.S., they did pass in the House legislation to end normal trade relations with both Russia and Belarus. And part of that legislation also gives the U.S. trade representative the orders, really, to try to move Russia out of the World Trade Organization. Remember, U.S. was at the forefront of bringing Russia into the World Trade Organization 10 years ago. 10 years later, the U.S. trade representative now being given instruction to do quite the opposite. So we'll have to see if Washington picks up some of these other requests, including additional sanctions or U.S. business pressures inside Russia.
Absolutely. Jessica, let's talk about the fallout of the new alliances that is now coming to fore. The U.S. has warned China against providing any kind of military aid or sanctions relief to Russia. What can you tell us about the interaction, and what kind of relationship are we seeing and foreseeing, rather, between Beijing and Moscow here on?
Well, as you probably know, U.S. President Biden is on the phone at this hour with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and they are talking after a week of diplomacy on this issue about China's role in what's happening in Ukraine. The U.S. is still pushing Beijing to renounce and denounce and condemn the Ukraine invasion, also to steer clear of providing any military or economic support to Moscow. There is U.S. intelligence that says actually China has been willing to give Russia some help militarily. And so on Monday, we saw National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Rome meeting for 7 hours with Yang Jiechi, the chief diplomat from Beijing, about all of these matters. And China has a lot of sway here, of course, because not only does it have this close relationship diplomatically that it established right before the Olympics, it also is Russia's largest trading partner. It's also Russia's largest preserver of foreign currency, and that means that it could do a lot to help stabilize the ruble. So the White House weighing additional sanctions against China, what we would call secondary sanctions, for violating some of these principles. But also we've heard from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki that she put it in stark terms. She said that Beijing accounts for about 15 to 20% of the global economy. The G7 accounts for about 50%. And so it is the White House's opinion that they can work with allies throughout the world, not just in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, to further isolate Beijing if it chooses to help Moscow.
Jessica, thank you so much for all those insights. We'll come back to you for more insights. Stay with us on this special broadcast while we apprise our viewers with more insights. Now, Russia, as we know, is pounding residential areas in Ukraine as Moscow continues its invasion. One such attack hit a high-rise apartment building in Kyiv, causing multiple casualties. Sergei Lysenko spoke to some of the survivors, and Voice of America's Anna Rice narrates this report. Take a look.
The Russian missile attack on this high-rise residential building in Kyiv on March 14th left at least 4 people dead. In the wake of the attack, Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko announced a curfew in Ukraine's capital. VOA spoke with a family who survived the attack but lost their apartment. They did not want to give VOA their names.
Last night the family slept in the bedroom, all 3 of us on the same bed. Me, my husband and our grown-up son. We were woken up at 5 in the morning because a balcony door fell on our son. We immediately knew that it was a direct hit. We ran into the living room to the balcony. My husband said there was a fire. We started packed up everything we could and ran outside.
Her family had moved to Kyiv 8 years ago from Donetsk, fleeing the fighting there between government forces and pro-Russian separatists.
We've lived through this in Donetsk, but it's not the same as it was in Donetsk. And we never thought that this could happen to us in Kyiv, and that we would be living through this again. It's scary.
While still terrified, the woman believes the Russian invasion has changed Ukraine, uniting people and making them stronger than ever.
Living here for the past 3 weeks in this horror, it's become clear since day one that indeed our country has never been this united.
She adds that if the Russian attacks on apartment buildings are supposed to scare Ukrainians, they have had the opposite effect.
Are they close to succeeding? They aren't even a drop closer to reaching it, and will never get there.
With more and more residential areas in Kiev coming under fire, about half of the city's population has fled. But many others are choosing to stay, to fight and risk their lives to defeat the Russian invaders. For Serhiy Lysenko in Kiev, Anna Rice, VOA News.
For more details, we still have Voice of America's correspondent Jessica Stone with us on this special broadcast live from Washington. Jessica, thanks for staying on. Now, the White House has announced that President Joe Biden will head to Brussels next week to coordinate deterrence and defense efforts with NATO allies. What more can you tell us about the same?
Well, a couple of things. I think the NATO allies will be very interested to hear how President Biden characterizes the conversation he had with President Xi. Many of them have very close trading relationships with China, as you know. And also, President Biden has called President Putin a war criminal. And that has legal implications, potentially. We've also had the Secretary of State echo those remarks. So the question becomes, what legally could happen out of that? Will that be part of the discussion at NATO? Will there be some sort of legal declaration? We've already seen the ICJ condemn the Russian invasion. We've had the United Nations condemn the invasion. Will there be additional steps taken to prosecute Vladimir Putin? Still unclear, though, whether President Biden will be able to continue his travels eastward to meet with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy or to meet with refugees, even in Poland. Remember that strong signal, that the leaders of Slovenia, Poland, and Czech Republic made by taking that brave train trip over to meet with President Zelenskyy in Kyiv.
Right.
That certainly sent a strong signal of support. And so we wonder if President Biden will do the same type of thing. Perhaps not quite that risky, but some show of support, I think, is something we should be watching for. The White House will be making the case all along that Biden has been successful in bringing these NATO groups together, but there really aren't on the agenda any clear decisions to be made at this meeting, with the exception of perhaps one thing, and that is this: will NATO provide those Russian-made Polish jets to Ukraine to further help their military? That still is an open question we could hear come out of this meeting.
Right, Jessica, I want to also spend some time discussing the impact of global sanctions, the Western sanctions on Russia. Now, till now, we've seen the West impose different rounds of sanctions, all in a way to kind of punish President Putin for his actions in Ukraine. President Putin recently gave a long address acknowledging the heavy toll of global sanctions on the Russian economy. What are the implications here that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, for those of us who are not close trading partners with Russia, there aren't a lot of implications on the short-term trading relationships. But we know that the OECD has just said that this Ukraine crisis is probably going to reduce global GDP by 1%. So that's significant. We are seeing a global impact already. And as you mentioned, Vladimir Putin had to really give this address to the Russian people because they are struggling mightily. Their ruble is worth next to nothing. They're losing jobs right and left because factories are closing. They can't get the products that they need to eat or to feed their families or to even make things in these factories. And Moscow is now at risk of defaulting on its debt. But we heard Vladimir Putin say no price controls, no printing of money. He was very irate about the freezing of the reserves that he had put aside outside of Russia, which has been very limiting and costly to Moscow. And we even heard him offer incentives incentives to foreign companies to stay in Russia and continue to employ Russians. So we can tell there is a great deal of pain happening inside Russia. But trading partners that could also be impacted, let's look at Turkey. Turkey is in NATO. Turkey will be at that meeting, we expect, next week. Turkey relies heavily on Russia for its imports. In fact, Russia is its largest source of imports, and its currency, the lira, is already in trouble. So we could see some impact of sort of a currency contagion going on there. But more broadly, I think we will see, as we've discussed before, Europe moving away from Russia for its energy imports. Certainly, they have realized they have far too much dependence on Russian oil, and then Russia and China, as we've also discussed, moving closer together. So it'll be definitely something to watch. And that OECD number, that's significant. Ukraine crisis cutting down 1% off of global growth this year.
Right, Jessica Stone, thank you so much for all those insights, and thanks for joining us on this special broadcast at this hour.